Welcome to Epic. Hey, my name is Jake. I'm one of the executive leads on staff here at Epic, and thank you so much for worshiping with us today. If you're joining us online, thank you so much for worshiping with us today wherever you are. And so, hey, we are in week 2 of a series that we are calling Here I Am. If you were with us last week, we looked at the life of Nehemiah, and Nehemiah saw a need 900 miles away in Jerusalem, and so he left the comforts of the palace where he was at, traveled to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall. Now the wall in Jerusalem had been in rubble for about 140 years, and then Nehemiah shows up with a plan, and they're able to rebuild the wall in just 52 days. It is such an amazing story. If you weren't able to be here last week, I encourage you to go online and watch it last week. And today we're going to be looking at the life of another historical hero in the Old Testament. We're going to be looking at the call of Moses. And as I shared with you last week, throughout this series, you're going to have the opportunity to hear from some different voices in our church you don't normally hear from. Last week we got to hear a little bit about Tammy Shockey's story as she answered the call and God had put in her life, and she began to serve in children's ministry. And so today I'm going to share a little bit of my story and my calling into ministry, and we'll also be looking at the call of Moses as well. So now, before I jump into my story, I want to give you a very important date in my life, and that is Sunday, February 3rd, 2002. Now, does that date have any significance to anybody else? Does that date ring a bell? Something else happened that day, February 3rd, 2002? I'll give you a hint. The greatest show on turf. Anybody remember the St. Louis Rams, right? So the St. Louis Rams, they were nicknamed the greatest show on turf, and they consisted of a quarterback, Kurt Warner, Marshall Faulk, running back, and then they had a plethora of talent at the wide receiver position, namely Torrey Holt and Isaac Bruce. And so this was a high-flying offense. Now, this offense, they set some big records. So over the course of the 3-year period that they were known as the greatest show on turf, they scored over 500 points in each season. And in fact, they set the record for the most points scored in any 3-year consecutive period. And so this was a high-flying offense. And so they led the league, get this, for 3 years straight, in total offensive yards, total passing yards, and total passing touchdowns. Now the Rams, they had won the Super Bowl in the 1999-2000 season. And so they were expected to come back and win the following year, but they came up short. They actually got bounced in the first round. And so they came back into this third season, the 2001-2002 season, with kind of a chip on their shoulder, like they were going to win this year no matter what. And so here we are, it's Super Bowl Sunday, February 3rd, 2002, and I find myself at a Super Bowl party that I had been invited to by a longtime friend and mentor in my life. His name is Bill Fury, and so a bunch of us are gathered together watching this game, the St. Louis Rams, the greatest offense in history, and here they are trailing the New England Patriots in the fourth quarter, 17-3. So the greatest offense that we'd ever seen, and they'd only scored 3 points during the first 3 quarters of that game. But the game would be far from over. So Rams quarterback Kurt Warner, he runs in a touchdown in the fourth quarter. That gets them a little bit closer. The game then becomes this amazing defensive battle as the teams just go back and forth, stopping each other. But then Kurt Warner puts together this incredible drive. He makes this beautiful pass. Ricky Proehl runs a little 8-10 yard flat route, catches the ball. He's wide open, and then the defense approaches. But he manages to break through the defense and score a game-tying touchdown with just about 1:20 left on the clock. So all of a sudden, the entire place is going crazy. They're making the biggest comeback in NFL Super Bowl history. The game is tied 17-17. With 1:21 remaining on the clock. Now, before I tell you how the game ends, I want to back up about a decade here and go to the early 90s where I grew up. Anybody else grow up in the 90s? The 90s was a great time to be a kid. I absolutely loved growing up in the 90s. And a little bit about my story is I grew up in a Christian home. I've shared with you guys before, my father was he was a preacher, he was a missionary, and so I grew up in a Christian home, and going to church on Sunday morning was not an option. We went to church each and every Sunday, and but here's one thing I always say is just because you grew up in a Christian home, it doesn't mean that you're going to put God as the center of your life. In fact, I saw my older 2 siblings make a lot of decisions in their teenage years that kind of led them away from their faith. And so just because you grow up in a Christian house, it didn't really guarantee anything. And so I hadn't quite made God the Lord of my life at this point. I was still trying to find my way through middle school, and I was a little bit small for my age, and so I found other ways to kind of compensate. And so I became known as the class clown. Do we have any other class clowns out there? So you found a way to get, I see a bunch of hands. So the way you kind of put yourself on the radar is you would speak out in class, right? Yeah, you maybe would pick on people. And so sometimes I spent more time in the outside of the classroom, sitting in the hall or in detention than I did in that actual class. There were a couple of teachers that was the case for me. And so I'm trying to find my way, trying to fit in, trying to be popular, and the only way I can do it is kind of through, being the class clown. All right, so I'm at summer camp going into just came out of 6th grade, getting ready to go into 7th grade, and I went to summer camp that year, and we just had our students get back from summer camp, and so I just want to say thank you to all of our leaders who gave up their time this week to pour into our students. Let's give them a huge round of applause. So we had over 50 students go to camp. I've already heard some amazing stories of life change, and I just know the impact that happened this week is going to impact these students for years and decades to come. So thank you if you were one of the leaders who poured into our kids this past week. So here I am at summer camp, and I'm sitting around this fire pit outside of our cabin, and we're having one of those talks about eternity and heaven and hell, and I feel the heat coming from this fire, and I start thinking, I don't want to spend eternity in hell. I'm 6 feet from this fire and it's pretty hot. And so I kind of feel like I got scared into giving my life to Jesus. Either way, I gave my life to Jesus. And I remembered, okay, but it's not just about saying a prayer and then you have heaven. It was like, I need to actually make some life changes. And so I knew that the people at school that I was trying to impress and try to hang around with, I knew I had to make some changes when I went into 7th grade. And so going into school, that first day back at school, I normally would have walked in at lunchtime and sat at the popular table. Lunch, the cafeteria, you kind of have your spot, right? And so I would go and sit at the popular table. I was heading that direction, and I decided to make a turn and go sit at a different table. I remember thinking, if I'm gonna live for Jesus, I have to act different, I have to be different. And these people who have been trying to impress, they've kind of been bringing me down. So I put my tray down and sat next to these two people who I had spent many years picking on. And turns out they were just awesome people. I don't know why I picked on them for so long, but they weren't the popular kids, right? So I sat down, had a conversation with them. And then I kind of got my life on track. I started playing sports, and that kept me away from a lot of the trouble. But here's one thing I did, is when I came back from camp, I told myself that any opportunity that comes up where I can get closer to God, I'm gonna say yes to it. Now, have you seen that movie with Jim Carrey? It's called Yes Man, where he just starts saying yes to every opportunity that comes his way. That's how I was. And so if there was an opportunity and I was like, that'll bring me closer to Jesus, I was like, sign me up, I'll say yes, right? And so sure enough, these opportunities started to come. I was in a small church. We had a small youth group of maybe 15 people. And all of a sudden that fall rolls around, and the youth director at the church says, hey, there's something about 30 minutes away from here, and it's called Bible quizzing, where you actually study and memorize portions of the Bible, and then you compete on it. And we're gonna put a team together. So I'm like, sign me up. That'll get me closer to Jesus, right? So I sign up for something called Bible quizzing. And this is me way over here. I'm in 7th grade. The rest of this team is all juniors and seniors. And so this ended up being the top team from New York that went to the national tournament. And I'm this young punk on this team, right? And so this year we studied the book of Acts. And so what you would do is you would memorize full chapters of the book of Acts, and then every other week you'd get together and have a competition. And so I was a competitive kid, and so this was my way to get into the Bible, because I could do it competitively. And so here we are at the national tournament in Harrisburg, and I remember just like being so in love with the Bible and studying and memorizing. And then the next year rolled around, and I found out that there's something else nearby. It's called SWAT. Now, this had nothing to do with the military or a police task force. It stood for Serving, Witnessing, and Training. So I'm like, once again, sign me up. I'll do it. That'll get me closer to God. So I signed up for this thing called SWAT. And I'd spend about 9 months throughout the year learning how to lead people to Jesus. We'd learn how to do a vacation Bible school. And then over the course of the summer, we'd go spend a week in New York City, where we would take everything that we learned throughout the year, and we would run a vacation Bible school for a church in the inner city. And then at night, we would take these care packages full of food and toothbrushes and sandwiches, deodorant, and we'd go down and spend a couple hours ministering to the homeless each night. I don't mean like drop a bag and say, here you go, God bless you. We would actually spend a couple hours sitting there talking with them, praying with them. And so I began at a very young age to, one, I was getting to know Scripture, and two, I was getting to do something practical by living out my faith. And so I had no idea that throughout those early years of my teenage years in the early 90s, that God was preparing me for ministry. See, ministry, it was not on my radar at all. Like most kids in high school, I dreamed of being a professional athlete. And so I played basketball every second of the day, and anytime I had some free moments, I was playing basketball, and I wanted to be a professional basketball player. Well, as you can see, I'm not a professional basketball player. So I had a big foot as a young kid. It was a size 13 in 7th grade. Everybody always said, Snowden, you're gonna grow into your feet. Well, they were wrong. I never did. I capped out about 5'11", 6 feet tall. I had these big old clown feet growing up. But anyway, so I had this dream to play NBA basketball. That wasn't gonna happen. And so when I saw that dream coming to an end, I was like, all right, I gotta think of something that I wanna do. So I started looking into the military. I thought about going into the Air Force. I also thought about going to college. Turns out I did neither. I ended up moving with my best friend from upstate New York, and we moved all the way across the country to Southern California. And so we were 18 years old when we did that. And I found myself out in Southern California, basically saying, all right, here I am. Let's kind of figure life out in sunny California. So start going to this church. It was this mega church in the area. We'd go 1 or 2 weeks. We meet the college director, and she says to us, hey, if you're looking for work, why don't you work at the church? We've got over 350 positions here. So I'm like, oh, there's gotta be something I can do at the church, right? Now, that was new to me because the church I was a part of growing up, you had like 2 people on staff. There was the lead pastor, and then there was like a part-time secretary, and that was the whole church staff, right? Everybody else was volunteer. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'll put in my resume. And so I'm putting things on my resume like SWAT and Bible quizzing, because that's really all I had at this point, right? And it turns out I ended up getting a job at the church. I'm working in a position that was called utilities. And so they had a school on campus from kindergarten to 8th grade. They would do weddings and funerals almost every day. It was just a huge, huge church. And so I'm changing light bulbs, setting up tables and chairs for banquets and stuff like that. And really just kind of like figuring life out on my own as an 18-year-old in Southern California. So all of a sudden, I start getting asked to do other things. The high school director approaches me and says, hey, we're looking for some people to serve in ministry. And I was like, well, I'm only 18. I probably can't serve in high school. And she's like, well, what about serving in the middle school? So I sign up to become a middle school volunteer. And I'm mentoring, 10, 11, 12-year-old boys and kind of going to summer camp with them and having a great time. And then within that first year in California, I also learned how to play guitar. And so get this, I'd only been playing guitar for about 6 months, and then all of a sudden I was asked to fill in and lead for our student worship band on a Sunday morning. I'm like, well, I only know how to play like 3 or 4 songs, so you're gonna get every song that I know how to play, right? So I fill in and play that week. It turns out that the reason I was asked to fill in is our normal student worship band, they were doing an audition at another church to be the worship band for that church. So they end up getting the gig, and so all of a sudden, I'm like, hey, they asked me, can you do that again? And so all of a sudden I found myself leading worship. I'm 18, 19 years old here. I'm leading worship. I only knew 3 songs. So I'm like, I got to learn some more songs quick. And so I put together a little band. We start leading, and now God's using me to lead this worship team for our student ministries. And so life is starting to happen. I end up going to film school the next year. That leads toward a promotion at the job I was at. So I get promoted from utilities. I'm now working in the media department at our church. So life is going good. Also, like I said, I was really competitive. And so I got hired part-time at Vineyard Christian School to be their head football coach. So I'm coaching football. This is awesome, loving that. And then I guess that went well enough because they asked me to coach basketball during the winter. So I did football and basketball a couple of years. The 3rd year rolls around. And they were lacking a soccer coach. So they asked me to coach soccer. So I'm like, sure, I'll coach soccer. So I find myself working almost full-time year round at a Christian school in town as well. And so it's crazy to think that like at this young age, in late teens, early 20s, that God is just using me. The more that I said yes, that here I am, God just kept throwing opportunity after opportunity my way. So for someone in their early 20s, I kind of had a lot going on. I'm serving with students. I'm leading worship. I'm coaching, I'm going to film school, and of course, my full-time job in the media department at church. So looking back, it's like my life really could have gone any number of directions. God could have used me in so many different ways. And I had my idea of how I thought it was gonna look. I'm going to film school. I had dreams to become, the next like Steven Spielberg. I wanted to write movies and make feature films. And so I kind of thought I was going that way. Now, for some of you, maybe you've been in a similar situation too, where you kind of felt like you had a lot going on and your life could go a certain number of many different ways. Now, do you ever remember being in that situation and you're just unsure which direction life is gonna go, how things might play out? Well, when you think about that, it kind of reminds me of the story we're gonna look at today. We're gonna be in Exodus chapter 3, looking at the call of Moses. Now, this chapter, Exodus 3, it's one of my favorite passages in scripture, because if you have ever felt the call of God on your life, then you can probably relate to Moses quite a bit. So let me give you a little recap of where Moses is in Exodus chapter 3. At this point in his life, Moses, he's 80 years old. Now, Moses only lived to be 120. I say only 120 because some people live to be, several hundred years old in the Old Testament. So Moses lived to be 120. So he's two-thirds of his way through life when he is called by God. And so if you're not familiar with all of Moses, he was never supposed to make it 80 years old. In fact, he was never supposed to make it 80 seconds old. You see, when Moses was born in Egypt, there was a decree that Pharaoh had put out that all male Hebrew children were to be killed. They were to be thrown into the river and drowned. And so when Moses was born, his mother, what she did is she hid him for 3 months. And it says that when she could no longer hide him any longer from Pharaoh, she put him in this basket, hid him in the reeds in the Nile River. Now, one day, the Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, she goes down to the water to bathe, and she comes across this basket, and she opens up the basket, and lo and behold, there's a baby in the basket. And so she has compassion on the baby, and so she wants to care for the baby. She sends for Moses' mom. Fast forward several years later, and she actually adopts Moses into her family. And so now this Hebrew baby who was supposed to be killed and thrown into the river has been adopted into this Egyptian lifestyle, and Moses would grow up in the palace as a prince. And so the first 40 years of Moses' life, he's trained and educated in Pharaoh's court, and up until one day when Moses sees one of his fellow Israelites getting beaten. And if you know the story, what does Moses do? He in turn murders this Egyptian who was beating one of the Israelites. And real quickly, he realized what he did was wrong, and so he hides the body. He thought that he got away with it, but then the very next day, it says there were some other Egyptians who saw him, and they said to him, "Are you gonna try to kill us just like you killed the other Egyptian?" And so real quick, Moses realizes, I didn't get away with that murder. He realizes he's in trouble. Pharaoh finds out about it, and now Pharaoh wants to kill Moses. So what does Moses do is he escapes. Moses flees to the desert. He goes out to a place called Midian, and here in Midian, he would become a shepherd for the next 40 years of his life. So Moses, he's working as the shepherd. He's leading the sheep from one pasture to another. And this whole 40-year process, Moses has no idea that God is using him and preparing him for something bigger. So right now he's leading sheep from one place to another, but soon God is going to call him to lead about 1 million people from one place to another out of Egypt and into the promised land. And so I want to ask, how long have you been doing your job? Moses has been doing this for 40 years. He's probably on shepherding autopilot, right? So who's been doing their in the same career for at least a decade? Okay, how about 20 years or more? All right, 30 years or more. So, okay, hands are starting to go down. So Moses had been doing the same thing for 40 years, leading sheep from one place to another, being a shepherd. Now, here's the cool thing, is he's just out in the wilderness, out in the desert, doing his normal everyday thing when something out of the ordinary happens that day. And now Moses, he has no idea that his life is about to change while he's just going about his normal everyday. It's really just another day at the office for Moses. Now, have you ever noticed that sometimes in life, the biggest things that take place in your life, they're not the things that you planned and prepared for. They're things that just seem to come out of left field. They just come out of nowhere. And so maybe you feel like you've been praying or preparing for something your whole life, but then you come across something else that just takes you by surprise. I think of like David. He's told by his father to just go and take some lunch to his brothers who are serving in the military. And so he shows up and he takes some food, not knowing that there's a giant there named Goliath, and his life would be forever changed after that day. So you might be thinking right now that there's really nothing special going on in my life right now. There's nothing that I'm planning for is working out. Nothing I'm preparing is working out. And you're just kind of going through life on autopilot. But I want to encourage you to just wait. Just wait and be expectant, because you never know when that time is coming, when that day is coming where God is going to change everything and you're going to sense or you're going to hear the call of God upon your life. So this is how it happened for me. One of the first moments where I knew that God was calling me. So this brings us back to the Super Bowl party that I was attending, February 3rd, 2002. Tied game, 17-17, 1:21 to go in the fourth quarter. And in walks first-year starter quarterback, 24-year-old Tom Brady. Now I'm 24 years old at the time too. And so Tom Brady walks into this game with 1:21 left. They have no timeouts. They got to go 83 yards down the field. And so as they're getting ready to take that first snap, you hear the announcer, John Madden, saying, well, the really smart thing to do here is they just need to get to overtime, so they're going to just hand the ball off, right? But instead of handing the ball off and killing the clock, Tom Brady starts throwing pass after pass. And John Madden is just losing his mind, because if he throws an interception, the Rams are going to just run it in for a touchdown or have an easy field goal and win the game right there. So he is just losing his mind that Tom Brady's making pass after pass, marching his team down the field. So they get a little bit past half field, midway, and then all of a sudden they're in a position to kick a game-winning field goal as time expires from 48 yards. So Adam Vinatieri kicks his beautiful kick right down the middle. The place goes crazy. The clock, 3, 2, 1 expires. And this greatest show on turf that had the best offense in history would walk away with just one Super Bowl in those 3 years. And really what you had happening on this stage was this quarterback that nobody knew anything about, Tom Brady, and it would be usher in and give birth to this dynasty for the New England Patriots for the next almost 20 years. And so it's this setting here, where as exciting as the moment is and as significant as the moment that is in Tom Brady's life, a few moments later would get very significant for me. So as people start leaving the party and exiting, my friend Bill Fury, who'd been a mentor, he says, hey, Jake, can you stay behind for a few minutes? So I stay back and I'm like, hey, what's up? And he's like, yeah, sit down. We're going to talk for a few. And he's like, hey, I just see all the different things that you're doing. I see how God is using you in so many ways. He's like, here's what I'd like you to do. I've got a lot of responsibilities. He was the athletics director where I was coaching. He's like, I'm getting more and more responsibilities at the school. And so I need to step down from the church that he was the youth pastor at a church. He's like, I need to step away from that. He's like, but I want to recommend that you take the job. I'm like, whoa, hang on. You want me to be the youth pastor? I'm 24 years old here. I haven't gone to Bible school. I'm going to film school. I have a plan to go and make movies. This isn't quite on my radar. But I remember in that moment saying to him, I was like, Bill, I'd love to, but I'm just not qualified. I was like, maybe a couple of years from now, but that's not something that's on my radar at this point. And I remember just feeling like, looking at my life, the skills that I had, I can serve as a small group leader. I can play a little bit of worship on a Sunday morning, but leading a youth group, I wasn't sure that I could do that based on the skills in my life. And he said something to me that I remembered till this day. And he says, Jake, God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. And then we talked for a few minutes about the life of Moses and how Moses did not feel qualified. Who would feel qualified to lead people out of Egypt and to have to go before Pharaoh? But that phrase stuck with me, and I was like, you know what? And so I prayed about it, and I got back to him later that week and said, you know what, Bill, I'll do it. I'll lead this youth group. And so I remember thinking just how I was just lacking in strength to be put in that position, lacking in experience. But that's because I was basing it upon my strength and upon my experience. But if your ability to serve God is based upon your own experiences, if it's based upon your own strength, then you're always going to be bound by your own limitations. But listen to this. If your ability to serve God is based upon God's power and based upon God's strength, then there will be no limit to what God can do through you. As it says in Ephesians 3:20, it says, God is able, through his mighty power at work within us, to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think or imagine. And so if you are a Christ follower, if you have given your life to Jesus, then that means God is in you. The Spirit of God is in you. And so it is not your strength that you're working and operating on. It is the power of God working through you. So Exodus 3 and verse 1, it says, one day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it. So just as I was attending a Super Bowl party with no idea that I would be called that day, Moses, he's just going about his job, tending to his sheep. And then all of a sudden he notices something strange. He sees this bush on fire, and I'm sure he'd seen many bushes on fire being out in the wilderness. But what's so strange, this bush is on fire, but it's not being consumed by the fire. So it catches his attention. He approaches this strange sight, and as he gets closer, he hears something. He hears something calling his name, and it says, Moses, Moses. Now, has God ever done something unusual to catch your attention? And see, I believe that God does unusual things all the time to catch our attention. But a lot of times we don't even notice it, do we? You see, we can get so caught up running place to place at such a frantic pace that we often miss many of the burning bush moments in our lives. And think of it in your quiet time. Do you ever set aside time for God to speak to you? You know, when we go, if you have a daily quiet time with God, for many of you, it might look something like this. We're like, I got to read this chapter, or who listens now, right? A lot of times I'll listen using Audible. Instead of even reading, you're listening to one or two chapters. And then you say your prayer and you pray to God about all the things that he can do to make your life better. You pray for your friends maybe, pray for your church, and then it's kind of amen and you move on. Now imagine if that's how I treated other relationships in my life. Let's take my relationship with my wife, for instance. Imagine if Julie and I went out to lunch this afternoon, and it looked something like this, where we sat down, and I just talked her ear off, told her about everything that she could do to make my life better, and then I said, amen, got up and left. Like, that's insane, right? You would never do that with another person face to face, but aren't we guilty of doing that with God? We just talk his ear off, tell him about everything he can do to make our life better, and say, all right, amen. And so if that's your regular routine with God, how many times are you missing what God wants to say to you because you haven't created space to listen to the voice of God? So church, I want to encourage you. Take time to hear from God. Take time to notice what God is saying, because sometimes God calls out very quietly, just like he did to Moses. Moses, Moses. So Moses, in verse 4, this is his response. Moses responds. He doesn't even know it's God yet, but he hears his name and he just says, here I am. Now, if I was 80 years old wandering around the desert, hearing my name being called from a bush, I'd probably be questioning a few things about me, right? But then the voice, not only is it calling his name, now it starts to give him instructions. It says, Moses, take off your sandals. The place that you are standing is holy ground. Imagine being just watching somebody walk up to a bush, take off their sandals, because they think the bush is talking to them. And so here's Moses. He's responding. He's answering, following the instructions that have been given to him. And then in verse 6, the bush finally identifies itself. It says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord goes on to tell Moses a few verses later that he has seen the misery. He's seen the suffering of Israel, of his people. is they're under the control and under the bondage of the Egyptians. So in verse 10 it says, "Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people out of Egypt." In verse 11, Moses responds probably pretty similar to how we would respond and how we do respond most of the time. He says, "Who am I? Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt?" You see, Moses felt inadequate. Moses felt not good enough, not qualified enough to be called by God. And so his initial response is, "Who am I?" It's a response of inadequacy. And for many of us today, we might feel inadequate. We might feel unqualified. We might feel not good enough. And you see, when we feel inadequate, we often have the tendency to resist the call of God. So Moses, he says, "Who am I?" But here's something he didn't realize. He didn't realize that he's just like one of those just like that burning bush. See, there must have been thousands of bushes all throughout the desert. But what was different about this one bush that was speaking to him and telling him to take his sandals off? The one difference between that bush and all the other bushes is that God was in the bush. And God was going to be in Moses. And that makes all the difference. See, God in you is what makes all the difference. And so if you do not recognize that it is the Spirit of God in you, then you will come up with an endless list of excuses for not serving God. So Moses, he's lacking confidence because he's not focusing on God's ability. His confidence is lacking because he's focused on his ability and on his past performance. See, when God calls you, you need to put your focus on his purpose, not on your past. So he says, "Who am I?" And that might sound like a good excuse, but in reality, it's a very selfish statement. It's looking inward. Who am I? Moses' eyes are on himself and his abilities. And have you ever noticed that the greatest battle that we'll ever face in doing God's will is the battle we fight with ourselves? Now, in his youth, Moses had some failures. You know, we all do. Moses once killed an Egyptian and tried to cover it up and ran away and tried to start a brand new life. And because of his past failures, he doubted that God could use him. Have you ever doubted that God could use you because of your failures? So after murdering this Egyptian, Moses, he'd been in hiding for 40 years, and there's no way that Moses felt worthy enough to accept such a calling. But then in Exodus 3:12, God says to Moses, God says, "I will be with you. And this is your sign that I am the one who has sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this very mountain." So number one, when God calls you, I challenge you to put your focus on his purpose. Put your focus on his purpose, not on your past. And number two, when God calls you, put your confidence in his calling, not in your credentials. So not only is Moses concerned about his past failures, but when he responds by saying, "Who am I?" he's focusing upon his credentials and his abilities. His eyes are on himself. So of course he's questioning his confidence in how well he can serve God. You see, because at this point in the story, Moses didn't have much on his resume that would prepare him for such a calling. And I can relate, in my ministry experience, I didn't feel like at the moment that I had a lot that was on my resume. You know, accepting a position as a student director, and I hadn't gone to Bible school. I'm going to film school. Yeah, I had memorized a bunch of the Bible as a teenager, but I didn't feel like I was really prepared to lead teenagers. There's other positions, almost every position that I've accepted throughout the years in ministry, I didn't feel qualified for. I didn't feel like my credentials. And so sometimes I'd be like, "Are you sure you want me to interview for that job, God? Are you sure you're calling me out?" But that's because I was focusing on me. But when you focus on God and his power and his strength, then it changes the whole thing. Look at verse 13 here as we continue. Moses protests. He says, "If I go to the people of Israel and tell them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask, 'What is his name? What should I tell them?'" And that may seem like a reasonable excuse, but if you take a closer look, this is an excuse that's rooted in fear. Moses is using an excuse that many of us use today. He's saying, people will ask me questions and I won't know how to give them a good answer. Lord, if I take the job, I'm not gonna have all the answers for that job. And so church, if you wait until you have all the answers before you respond to God's call, then you will never experience all that God has for you in this life. Verse 14, God replied to Moses. He says, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And what does that really mean? I am who I am. What is God saying to Moses? He says, Moses, you may not have all the answers, but you have all of me. I am who I am. The great I am will be with you. See, there's gonna be times in your life where you're not gonna have all the answers. People will ask you questions that you will not be able to give a proper answer. There'll be times in your life that people will question you based upon your abilities, based upon your education, based upon your experience. And in those times, you will need to respond just as Moses did and say, but God has sent me. God is in me. It's not my strength, it's not my credentials. God's simply using me. And have you ever doubted your calling based upon your credentials? I want to tell you today just how much of a relief it is to know that your calling is not dependent upon your credentials. It's not about what you've done. It's about what God wants to do in you and about what God wants to do through you. So as we close today, I want to ask you this question. What does God want to do in you? What does God want to do through you? How is God calling you today? Maybe God is calling you to step up and serve in ministry. Maybe God's calling you to respond to a need in your neighborhood. Maybe God is calling you to start that nonprofit business that he's put on your heart and you, for whatever reason, you've been hesitating. But remember, it's not your strength, it's God's strength. God simply wants to work through you. He needs you to just say, here I am. Yes, Lord. And so as we close today, we're gonna close a little bit different. Rather than me praying out loud for all of us together, I just want you to bow your heads and I just want you to listen. For the next 30 to 60 seconds, just listen. Maybe God has you today on just what seems to be just an ordinary Sunday, but maybe today is a burning bush moment for you. And God is using the worship. He might be using the teaching through his word to speak to you today about something that you know he's been calling you to. And so I want to just give you some space to sit in his presence and just listen to him, listen to his voice. And then after about a minute, we'll close in a song together. But for now, just say, God, how are you speaking me today? How are you calling me to today?